Clara Whitmore did not scream when they told her. The man she had traveled 2,000 miles to marry was already in the ground. She did something worse. She laughed. One short, broken sound, not from happiness, not from madness, but from the particular cruelty of a moment so impossible that her body simply refused to believe it. Then she pressed both hands flat against her stomach, looked the stranger in front of her directly in the eye, and said in a voice that did not shake even slightly, "Take me to his grave. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now and ring that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. And drop your city name in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far Clara's story travels." Now let's go back to that platform, back to that moment, back to the day everything changed. The conductor called out Red Hollow, Montana Territory, the same flat way he had called every stop since St. Louis, bored, already thinking about the next town, already somewhere else in his mind. Clara Whitmore was not somewhere else. Clara Whitmore had been nowhere but Red Hollow for 11 months. She pressed both hands against the cold glass of the train window and leaned forward. And she looked at that platform the way a person looks at something they have been building inside their head for so long that the real version always comes as a small shock. Too ordinary, too dusty, the sign hand-painted instead of carved. The platform wood warped from weather instead of smooth and welcoming. But she was not disappointed. She was terrified, and she was thrilling with it. And those two feelings were so tangled together, she could not have separated them if she tried. She was 31 years old, and she was starting over. And the man waiting on that platform, the man she had never met, and somehow already loved through 43 letters over 11 months, was going to change everything. Except, there was no one on that platform holding flowers. No one scanning the train windows for a face they had never seen. No one waiting. Clara told herself he was simply late. She told herself the wagon had thrown a shoe, or the road had been difficult, or any one of 100 ordinary explanations that meant nothing was wrong. She stepped off the train onto the platform, set her travel bag down beside her trunk, and waited. The platform cleared around her. Passengers dispersed. The conductor collected the steps. The locomotive began the slow, grinding business of preparing to leave, indifferent to everything. She was still standing there when the man approached. He was not Benjamin Caldwell. She understood that immediately. The way you understand certain things before you can explain them. He was tall and dark-eyed and somewhere in his mid-30s, with the kind of weathered look that comes from years of outdoor work and not from age. He was holding his hat in both hands in front of him, turning the brim in a slow, deliberate circle. She had never seen Benjamin Caldwell's face, but she knew this was not him. This man looked like someone carrying the weight of something he did not want to put down. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Yes," she said. "My name is Nathaniel Caldwell." He paused. Just one beat. One single beat of silence that lasted approximately forever. "I'm Benjamin's brother." She waited. He turned the hat brim one more slow rotation. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I need to tell you something. And there is no good way to say it, so I'm just going to say it plain. My brother passed away 3 weeks ago. A fever, it came on fast, and it didn't give us much time. I sent a telegram to the station in Pittsburgh, but I don't know if it reached you." "Clearly it didn't reach you." He stopped. "I'm sorry." "I am truly deeply sorry. You should not have had to find out this way." Clara heard every word. She processed every word. And then something happened inside her chest, some wire pulled too tight, finally snapping, and she laughed. One short, cracked sound that came out of her before she could stop it. And she pressed both hands flat against her stomach and held them there. "He's dead." "Yes, ma'am." "Benjamin Caldwell is dead." "Yes, before I arrived 3 weeks before." His voice was entirely steady. She would think about that later, how steady his voice was. What it must have cost him. "I am so sorry." She looked out past him at the road beyond the station. At the wagons. at the horses tied to the post, at the ordinary, terrible, continuing world. Then she looked back at him. "Take me to his grave," she said. Something moved across Nathaniel Caldwell's face, surprise. And something beneath the surprise that she couldn't name yet. "Ma'am, his grave," she said again. "I came 2,000 miles to meet this man. The least I can do is say goodbye to him properly." She picked up her travel bag. "Will you take me, or do I need to ask someone else for directions?" Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. Then he put his hat back on his head, reached down, and picked up her trunk. "I'll take you," he said. Benjamin Caldwell was buried in the small church cemetery half a mile outside Red Hollow, under a white oak that was already beginning to turn at the edges with the first whisper of coming autumn. The headstone was simple. His name, his years 1,836 to 1,874, and below that, one line that Clara read 3 times, "A man of his word." She stood in front of it for a long time. Nathaniel stood a few feet behind her, far enough to give her space, close enough that she was aware of him, a quiet, steady presence at her back. Clara looked at that stone and tried to feel something clean and definable. Grief, loss, the particular sorrow of something that never got the chance to begin. Instead, what she felt was stranger and more complicated, a grief that had no clean edges. Because what she was mourning was not quite a person she had known. It was a possibility, a future, 11 months of careful hope that had been building towards something that no longer existed. She had crossed half a continent for a man she had never met. She had sold her furniture and her extra winter coat and packed her entire life into a single wooden trunk for a man whose voice she had never heard. She had believed, completely and without reservation, that 43 letters were enough to know a person's heart. Standing in that churchyard, she was no longer certain of anything. "He was a good man," Nathaniel said quietly from behind her, not offering it as comfort, exactly, more the way you state a fact that seems important to say out loud. "Tell me something true about him," Clara said. "Not something polite. Something true." A pause. "He worked harder than anyone I ever knew," Nathaniel said. "He built this ranch from almost nothing after our father died. And he never once complained about it. He was not a man who found talking easy. Feeling things, yes, saying them." Another pause. "He wanted a partner, a real one, someone to build something with." That was true. Whatever else you might be thinking right now, that part was true. Clara nodded once. "All right," she said. She turned away from the grave. She looked at Nathaniel Caldwell, directly, for the first time, really looked. Not just processing his presence, but actually seeing him, and she made a decision. "Your mother is at the ranch," she said. "Yes, ma'am, and you have a spare room." "We do." "Then I'll come," she said. "Not forever. Just until I work out what comes next." She picked up her bag. "If the offer is honest." "It is," he said. Something shifted in his expression, not quite relief, but adjacent to it. "It's honest, Miss Whitmore." "Clara," she said. "If I'm staying in your house, you'll call me Clara." He looked at her for just a moment. "Clara," he said, and he picked up her trunk and she followed him to the wagon. And they drove back through Red Hollow, without speaking. And the town watched them pass with the open curiosity of a small place that has already decided it wants to have an opinion. The Caldwell Ranch sat 3 miles north of Red Hollow on a low rise above a creek that caught the afternoon light and threw it back silver. Margaret Caldwell came out of the front door before the wagon had fully stopped. She was small and straight and fast-moving, with gray hair pinned back and sharp eyes that had clearly been doing considerable crying recently, though her face right now was perfectly composed. She came to Clara's side of the wagon and held out both hands. And Clara took them, and Margaret gripped hard. "I know," Margaret said simply. "I know. Come inside. No lengthy apologies, no speeches. Just those 2 words and those 2 firm hands." And Clara felt something she had been holding very tight since the platform at Red Hollow began, very slightly, to loosen. Inside, the kitchen was warm and smelled of coffee and something baking. Margaret put a cup in Clara's hands before she had even fully sat down. And the coffee was stronger than anything Clara had tasted since her father's house. And she held the cup in both hands and let the heat soak into her palms. "You don't have to talk," Margaret said, sitting across from her. "You don't have to explain yourself or your plans or what you're going to do next. You can just sit there and drink that coffee and be a human being who has had a very hard day." "That's generous of you," Clara said. "It's not generous, it's just sense." Margaret wrapped her own hands around her cup. "My son is dead. You traveled halfway across this country to be his wife. Neither of us needs to perform anything for the other right now." Clara looked at her. "No," she agreed, "I suppose we don't." They sat in silence for a while. And it was not an uncomfortable silence, the kind that happens between people who have both been through something hard and recognize that in each other, without needing to discuss it. Nathaniel came in once to say he was seeing to the horses, and went back out. Margaret refilled Clara's cup without asking. Outside, the light shifted from afternoon gold to early evening blue. And somewhere across the yard, a dog barked once and went quiet. Later, Margaret showed her to a small room at the top of the stairs. The bed was made up with a quilt, old, heavy, faded blue and white, and there was a pitcher of water on the stand, and a hook on the back of the door for hanging clothes. "Sleep," Margaret said from the doorway. "Everything else can wait until morning." "Thank you," Clara said. "For all of this." Margaret looked at her with those sharp, kind eyes. "Thank me by staying long enough to get your feet under you," she said. "That's all I ask." She pulled the door shut behind her. Clara sat on the edge of the bed in the quiet room and looked at her wooden trunk, which Nathaniel had carried up, without being asked, and placed precisely at the foot of the bed. And she thought about the tin box inside it, and the 43 letters wrapped in cotton squares, and the man who had written them, who was now under a white oak tree in a churchyard half a mile outside of town. She thought about the line on his headstone, "A man of his word." She thought, "I never heard his word. I only ever read it." She lay back on the quilt without undressing and stared at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling around her cattle distant in the south pasture. The creak of old wood, wind through the grass, and she told herself she was going to be all right. She was not entirely sure she believed it, but she said it anyway. Because sometimes that is the only honest thing left to do. She woke before dawn and did not know where she was. The ceiling was wrong. The sounds were wrong. The weight of the quilt was different from anything she knew. For exactly 4 seconds she was completely lost, floating in some space between sleep and sense. And then everything came back: the train, the platform, the churchyard, the headstone, and she pressed both palms flat on the quilt and breathed deliberately until her heart slowed. She dressed. She went downstairs. Margaret was already in the kitchen. She handed Clara an apron without comment, and Clara put it on. And they made breakfast together, side by side in the early gray light biscuits, eggs, coffee, and by the time Nathaniel came in from the early barn chores, there was food on the table, and the kitchen smelled like something real and habitable. And Clara had the strange, disorienting feeling that she had been doing exactly this for much longer than one morning. That feeling frightened her a little. She sat with it anyway. In the days that followed, Clara built herself a life in the shape of a temporary one. She told herself it was temporary. She helped with the household because she was not a woman who could sit idle. Not because she was staying. She learned where things were kept: the good dishes, the sewing basket, the ledger Margaret used for the household accounts, because knowing where things were made a place functional. Not because it made it home. She watched Nathaniel work. She could not help it. He was simply always there, early in the yard, out to the north pasture, back to the barn, repairing the fence line along the creek, moving through the work of the ranch with a quiet, steady efficiency that was almost startling to watch. He did not waste motion. He did not perform effort. He simply worked, day after day, carrying the weight of everything his brother had left behind without complaint and without apparent expectation that anyone would notice. She noticed. She was trying not to notice, but she noticed. And then the small things began. The first was the music box. She had mentioned at breakfast, to Margaret, not to Nathaniel, who was not even in the room, that she was having trouble sleeping in the quiet. Too used to the boarding house, she said. The sounds of neighbors through thin walls. The street below, the general human noise of a shared building. The ranch silence was a different kind of thing, vast and deep and a little pressing. That night there was a small music box on her windowsill. She had not put it there. It was old painted wood case. Brass mechanism inside, and when she wound it, it played something slow and quiet that she almost recognized. Something that moved at the exact pace of a heart trying to settle. She picked it up and turned it over in her hands. She set it back on the windowsill and let it play until it wound down. She slept. The second thing was the sweet peas. She had been working in the kitchen garden with Margaret on a Tuesday morning pulling weeds, staking tomatoes, and she had said, to no one in particular, that she missed sweet peas. Her mother had grown them along the back fence every summer. And the smell of them was the smell of being 8 years old and not yet afraid of anything. 2 days later, a paper seed packet appeared under the corner of her door. Sweet peas. She stood in her doorway for a long moment, holding the seed packet, doing arithmetic in her head that she was not yet willing to complete. The third thing was the geology book. She had pulled it from the sitting room shelf. On a slow afternoon, it happened to be at the end of the row, easiest to reach, and she had been reading it on the porch for 20 minutes when she realized with genuine surprise that she was fascinated. The idea that the ground told stories, that the layers of stone were like chapters you could read if you knew the language, that everything beneath your feet was a record of time that had happened before anyone was there to remember it. She said aloud, to herself alone, on an empty porch. That is genuinely fascinating. And from around the corner of the porch, where he had apparently been sitting on the steps, working a length of rope, Nathaniel said, without looking up, the creek bend at the north end of the property shows it clearest. 3 distinct layers visible in the bank. Oldest one is gray-blue. Almost 200 million years. You can put your hand on it. Clara lowered the book. You can put your hand on 200 million years, she said slowly. Yes. He still wasn't looking at her. If you stay long enough, I'll show you. If you stay long enough. She looked at the side of his face, the jaw set with its habitual tension. The eyes on the rope in his hands, and she held that phrase in her chest and felt it press against something. Perhaps, she said carefully. He nodded once the way he did, and went back to the rope. She looked down at the book and could not read another word. The storm came on a Wednesday night in September, 3.5 weeks after Clara had arrived in Red Hollow. It announced itself first with a change in the air, something electric and close, and then with wind that hit the side of the house like a decision, and then with lightning that turned the whole sky white for a full, suspended second before the thunder came through the walls like something alive. Clara was awake before the second flash. She sat up and pulled her knees to her chest and placed both hands firmly on her own kneecaps and told herself with great determination that she was a grown woman and that thunder was simply compressed air and that there was nothing in this room that could harm her. She was 31 years old and she was still afraid of thunderstorms, and she had been since she was 7 years old when lightning split the oak tree outside her window straight down the middle and she had screamed, herself raw in the dark until her father came running. She had written about that night in a letter, in January, to Benjamin. She had been describing a Philadelphia storm, and almost in parentheses, almost apologetically, she had confessed the fear, the persistent, embarrassing, illogical fear that no amount of adult reasoning had ever fully resolved. And he had written back that there was nothing foolish about a fear you came by honestly, that the body remembered things the mind sometimes forgot, that when storms hit the ranch, he sometimes sat on the covered south porch, and listened from a safe distance, acknowledging the thing was bigger than him, and simply waiting it out together with it. She had loved that answer more than almost any other thing in 43 letters. She was thinking about it, about that specific answer, about that specific letter, when the knock came at her door. Soft 3 even beats. Nathaniel's voice. Quiet and steady. "I saw your light. You doing all right?" She looked at the candle she had lit without remembering lighting it. "Not especially," she said. "A pause. South porch is covered," he said. "Storm's coming west to east. You can watch it without being in it, if you want." She got up. She put on her wrapper. She followed him downstairs and through the kitchen and out the back door to the south porch. And they sat in the 2 old wooden chairs, the kind that had held so many people for so many years that they had shaped themselves into the general form of human rest, and they watched the storm move over the open fields. The lightning came in long, brilliant sheets. The thunder rolled through the grass and shook the air. The rain hit the porch roof like a continuous argument. And it was manageable. From here, with the roof above and the chair solid underneath and another person present in the dark. After a while, Clara said, "You knew I was afraid of storms, not a question." Nathaniel said nothing for a moment. "Benjamin mentioned it," he said. "He shared my letters with you. Some of them. When he wanted, he stopped. Chose different words. When he wanted another opinion on something." Clara looked at the storm. "How much did you read?" she said. "Enough," he said quietly. "Too much, probably." She turned that over. A music box for a woman who couldn't sleep. Sweet pea seeds for a woman who missed her mother's garden. "If you stay long enough, I'll show you." The covered porch in a thunderstorm. She said nothing else, neither did he. They sat in the dark and watched the lightning travel east until the storm thinned out, and the rain dropped to a whisper. And then Clara said goodnight and went back upstairs. And she lay in her bed with the music box still on the windowsill, and she stared at the ceiling and thought about arithmetic she still wasn't ready to complete. Margaret went into town on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks later. And for the first time since Clara had arrived, the house was empty except for her. She went looking for a candle, hers had burned to nothing, and she remembered seeing a tin of them on the shelf in the study. Benjamin's room. Still his room, in the particular way rooms stay belonging to people who are no longer in them. She knocked before she opened the door, because old habits are honest things. Inside, everything was as it had been left. The chair pulled close to the desk. The reading glasses on the corner. The particular stillness of a room that is waiting for someone who isn't coming back. The tin of candles was on the shelf. She took 2. She turned to leave. The desk drawer was open. Not much, a half inch. Maybe less. Open because there was too much inside it pressing out. The corner of a paper visible at the edge. She recognized the paper. Not the specific sheet she couldn't have, but the color of it. The weight, the particular ivory of the stationery she bought at the shop on Chestnut Street in Philadelphia that she had always considered a small and private luxury. Her stationery, her letters. She put the candles back on the desk. She pulled the drawer open. Inside, folded and unfolded and refolded many times, were her letters, a dozen of them, maybe more, and between them and behind them, written on loose sheets in a tight, controlled hand that was not Benjamin's rounded script, were notes, drafts, response fragments, some crossed out, some refined, some marked in the margins with questions or second thoughts. She picked up the top sheet. She asked why a person can know another through letters alone. "I have been thinking about this for 3 days, and here is what I believe." Her breath left her in a slow, complete fall. She picked up another. "Benjamin doesn't know how to answer what she wrote about her mother. The only true thing I can think to say is," and below that a full paragraph. Her handwriting in her memory overlaying the words, a paragraph she had read so many times the paper had worn soft at the fold. Familiar words, words she had held against her chest. Words she had believed came from a man who was now under a white oak in a churchyard. Words she was holding right now, in Nathaniel Caldwell's handwriting. She read every sheet in that drawer. She put everything back exactly as she had found it. She picked up the candles. She walked to the kitchen. She sat down at the table. She placed both hands flat on the surface and she waited. Nathaniel came in from the north pasture as the light was failing, dusty and tired, and he stopped in the kitchen doorway when he saw her. He looked at her face. He understood. He did not ask what she knew or how she knew it. He came inside and hung his hat on the peg beside the door, that small, habitual motion, and he sat down across from her at the table. And he waited too. How much of it was you? Clara said. Not a question, a starting place. Nathaniel looked at his hands on the table. The first 3 letters were his, he said, entirely his. Benjamin was a hard worker. He paused. Some men can feel a thing all the way to the bone and still not find the word for it. He asked me to help him respond to yours, just to help him find the language. Not to replace what he meant, just to say it. And then Clara said. He was quiet for a moment. And then I started reading your letters, he said. And he stopped. Miss Whitmore, I'm not going to sit here and make excuses for what I did. Good, she said. I don't want excuses, I want the truth. He looked up at her. The truth is somewhere around the 6th or 7th letter. I stopped helping Benjamin find his words and started using mine, he said. I told myself it didn't matter because the feeling was his, even if the language was mine. I was wrong. I knew I was wrong and I kept going. And then he died and you were already on a train and I had no weight. He stopped again. There's no part of this that I can make sound all right. So I'm not going to try. Clara looked at him steadily. The things in those letters, she said carefully. The thing about grief being a stone that gets smoother over time. The thing about starting over being the only honest choice when the road behind you has run out. The thing about the body remembering what the mind forgets. She paused. Were those yours? Completely. And the south porch in the thunderstorm, yes. The music box. He said nothing. Which was also yes. You've be stopped, started again. You've been responding to me this entire time, even after I arrived. Even after I was standing right here. You've been answering. I didn't know what else to do, he said. I couldn't tell you, and I couldn't stop. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the cattle moved in the south pasture. Biscuit shifted in the yard. The old house settled into its evening sounds. Clara looked at the man across the table, this quiet, contained, deeply strange man who had been writing her love letters under his dead brother's name, and then leaving her seed packets and music boxes in the dark rather than simply say one true word to her face. She felt simultaneously fury, sorrow, and something else she was not ready to name yet. You should have told me, she said. Yes, the moment I stepped off that train. Before anything else, you should have told me. No argument. No mitigation. I should have. I was a coward, and I should have. I came here for a man who doesn't exist, she said. I know. And the man who does exist has been hiding behind his dead brother's name since the day I arrived. Nathaniel said nothing. Because there was nothing to say to that. It was simply true. Clara stood up from the table. She crossed to the window and looked out at the yard, the barn. The water trough, Biscuit asleep in the last light, and she stood there for a long moment with her back to him. I'll pay for your passage back east, Nathaniel said. From behind her, his voice was steady and quiet, and it cost him something. That steadiness. She could hear the cost of it. Whatever you need. You came here for my brother. You are not trapped here because of me. Whatever you decide, I will make sure you have what you need to do it. Clara looked at the yard. She thought about Pennsylvania, about the boarding house, about the laundry and the mending and the other women's children, and the particular, patient darkness of a life with no one coming home to it. She thought about 43 letters. She thought about a man who had chosen over and over, for 11 months, to tell her the most careful and honest truths he knew. Even when it would have been easier not to. Even when he was giving those truths away under someone else's name. She thought about a stone in your pocket that gets smoother over time. She turned around. "I'm not going," she said. Nathaniel looked up. "I'm not asking you to justify yourself," she said. "I'm not saying I'm not angry. I am angry, and I don't know what any of this is yet, or what it could be, or whether it should be anything at all." She held his gaze. "But I am not getting back on a train. Not yet. Not until I understand what is actually here." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face shifted, not relief, not hope exactly, but something beneath both of those, something older and quieter. Like a man who has been standing braced against a blow. For so long he has forgotten what it feels like to simply stand. "All right," he said. "Don't thank me," she said. "I haven't decided anything." "I know," he said. She walked back to the table. She picked up her coffee cup, cold now, and held it in both hands. "Tell me one true thing about yourself," she said. "Not about Benjamin, not about the letters. One true thing. Right now, that you've never said to anyone." He looked at her. The silence lasted long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then Nathaniel Caldwell said, in a voice she had to lean forward slightly to hear, "I have been afraid my whole life that everything I am is only useful to other people. That I only matter when I'm standing behind someone else." He looked at his hands. "The letters were the first time in my life I said what I meant to someone who was listening to me. Even if she didn't know it was me." Clara looked at him. She set down her cup. "She knows now," she said quietly. And that was all. She went upstairs. She opened her trunk. She took out the tin box, and she sat on the edge of the bed and she read all 43 letters again from the beginning, not to grieve them. Not to indict them, but to find what was actually in them, now that she knew where to look. She was still reading when the sky outside turned gray with early dawn. What she found in those letters was not what she expected. She expected to find deception. She expected to find performance. She expected to find a hollow place where a real person should have been. Instead, she found someone who had been trying, with extraordinary care, to tell the truth every single time, even when the truth was the uncomfortable kind. Even when it would have been so much easier to simply say what she wanted to hear. She folded the last letter back into its cotton square. She placed it in the tin box. She closed the lid. Outside the window, the ranch was beginning its morning, the barn door. The cattle, the particular quality of Montana light coming over the eastern ridge, like something that means it. Clara stood up. She was still angry. She was also, underneath the anger, something else. Something she was not yet ready to call by its name. But it was there, real and specific, like a stone in her pocket that had not had time to get smooth yet. She went downstairs. Nathaniel was already at the kitchen table, both hands around his coffee cup, not looking at anything in particular. She crossed to the stove. She poured herself a cup. She walked to the table and sat down across from him. And she met his eyes, and she said, not warmly, not coldly, but with the particular directness of a woman who has decided to be honest about exactly where she is, "I read them all again last night." He looked at her. "Waiting. Every word was true," she said. "I want you to know that I can see that now. It doesn't fix the rest of it, but I can see it." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. "Thank you," he said. Just that. Clara wrapped both hands around her cup and looked out the kitchen window at the yard, filling slowly with morning light. She did not know what came next. But for the first time since she had stepped off that train onto a platform, with nobody waiting, for the first time since she had stood in front of a headstone that said a man of his word, and tried to grieve someone she had never actually met, she felt something that was not grief. And not anger, and not the hollow performance of being all right. She felt quietly and without drama, like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She didn't say that out loud. Some truths need more time before they're ready to be spoken. But she held it, carefully, like something fragile and real. Like a letter you have just received and are not quite ready to fold away. The morning after Clara read all 43 letters again, She came downstairs and did something that surprised even herself. She asked Nathaniel to teach her to ride, not because she needed to ride, not because it was practical or sensible or part of any plan she had formed, but because she had spent 11 months building a life in her imagination that belonged to someone else. And she was done with imaginary things. She wanted something real under her hands. Something that pushed back. Nathaniel looked at her across the breakfast table with that careful, unreadable expression she was starting to recognize as his version of genuine surprise. "You've never ridden," he said. "Never had cause to," she said. "I'm asking you to give me cause." He looked at her for another moment. Then he set down his coffee cup. "After chores," he said. "Meet me at the barn." Margaret, sitting at the end of the table with her ledger open, said nothing. But Clara caught the small, quick movement at the corner of the older woman's mouth, not quite a smile, but the shape of one, and filed it away without comment. She met him at the barn at 9:30. The horse he brought out was a brown mare with a white blaze down her nose and the calm, patient temperament of an animal that has spent years around nervous people and decided not to take it personally. "Her name is Agnes," Nathaniel said. "She's 16 years old and she hasn't spooked at anything since Lincoln was president." "That's either very reassuring or very sad," Clara said. Something moved in his expression. "Little of both, I reckon." He showed her how to approach, how to stand, how to let the horse know she was there before she touched her. He showed her how to hold the reins, not gripping. He said, "Not fighting, just enough contact so the conversation goes both ways." He walked beside her in circles around the yard for the better part of an hour. One hand near the bridle, not holding it, just present. He did not talk much. He corrected her hands twice, her posture once, said there quietly when she found the right seat, and said nothing at all for long stretches, which she found she did not mind. There was a particular kind of company that was comfortable because it did not demand anything, and Nathaniel Caldwell, whatever else he was, had mastered that kind. When she dismounted awkwardly, grabbing the saddle horn in a way he politely pretended not to notice, she stood beside Agnes and stroked the mare's neck and said, "Same time tomorrow," he said. "I want," she said. She walked back toward the house. She heard him behind her, leading Agnes back to the barn, and she heard him say something to the horse in a low voice, not words she could make out, just the murmur of it, and she made herself not turn around. That was the first day. The days that followed had a rhythm she had not expected. Riding lesson in the morning, household work with Margaret through the midday, reading on the south porch in the afternoon, or walking the kitchen garden, or working through the household accounts that Margaret had been keeping in a system that made complete sense to Margaret and to absolutely no one else. In the evenings, the three of them sat in the main room after supper, Margaret with her mending, Nathaniel with whatever repair or equipment needed tension, Clara with a book or her own needlework, and they talked, or did not talk, in the easy way of people who have established a shared domestic peace. It was almost ordinary. That was what frightened Clara. Because ordinary was seductive. Ordinary could make you believe things were settled when they were not. Ordinary could make you stop asking questions that still needed answers. She had not stopped asking questions. She was just doing it quietly, in the privacy of her own mind, where she could turn them over without anyone watching. The central question was one she could not quite make herself articulate directly. Even in private, it moved around the edges of everything she did and thought and noticed, like a sound in another room that you can hear but not quite place. It was not whether she trusted Nathaniel, she had not yet decided that. It was not whether she was angry, she was still, though it was shifting in quality, becoming less hot and more complicated. It was something more fundamental than either of those. It was, who am I now? She had come here as a bride. That was gone. She had come here with a clear, specific purpose, a man, a home, a future with a shape to it, and all of that had dissolved the moment she stepped onto a platform and heard the word "past." What she had instead was a room in someone else's house, a borrowed life, and a tin box full of letters that she now understood differently than she had when she packed them in Pennsylvania. She was not Clara Whitmore, mail-order bride. She was not Clara Whitmore. Widow, she had no right to that grief, not really. She was not sure what she was, and she was watching herself, day by day, start to become something in this house, in this ranch, in this particular patch of Montana territory, something that did not have a name yet, but that frightened and compelled her equally. It was on a Friday afternoon, 2 weeks after the kitchen table conversation, that the first real test came. She had walked into town for thread. Margaret needed a particular weight for mending the winter quilts, and Clara had offered because she wanted the walk, wanted the air, wanted the particular freedom of moving through space without any specific purpose beyond getting from one place to another. Red Hollow was not a large town. A main street with the general store, the post office, a hotel, a church at the far end, a saloon she did not look at directly. She had been there twice before, briefly, and both times people had been polite in the careful, surface way of small towns that have not yet decided what to make of a stranger. This time was different. She was in the general store, waiting while Mr. Holt found the thread, when she became aware of 2 women at the fabric counter behind her who were not making any particular effort to lower their voices. "That's her," the first one said. "The one staying out at the Caldwell place. I heard she came to marry Benjamin," the second one said. "She did, and now she's staying on with Nathaniel." A pause loaded with implication. "Margaret Caldwell must be beside herself," the first one said. "Margaret seems to think it's fine," the second one said, with the tone of someone who very much does not think it is fine. "But you have to wonder. Benjamin not even cold 3 months, and here she is, making herself at home, and Nathaniel's never shown interest in any woman. Never. So you have to wonder what exactly she..." Clara turned around. Both women stopped. They were perhaps 50, both of them, in the respectable dresses of women who considered themselves pillars of whatever passed for Red Hollow's social order. They looked at Clara with expressions that tried to rearrange themselves into neutrality and did not quite make it. Clara looked at them both for exactly 2 seconds. "Good afternoon," she said, with a pleasantness so precise it had edges. "I didn't catch your name." Silence. "No," she said agreeably. "I didn't think so." She turned back to the counter, took her thread from Mr. Holt, paid for it, and walked out of the store with her spine straight and her head up and her hands perfectly steady at her sides. She made it half a block before her hands started shaking. She stopped in the space between 2 buildings and pressed her back against the wall and breathed. The shaking was not fear. She identified it correctly, clinically, the way she had learned to do. It was anger. Pure and clean and slightly out of her control. She had known this was coming. She had known it since that first drive back from the churchyard, when she had felt the town watching them from every doorway and window. She had known it the way you know a storm's coming, from the way the air changes, before any visible sign. She had not known it would feel quite like this. Like being seen through a window you didn't know was there. Like being a story someone else was already telling. She breathed. She straightened. She walked back to the ranch. She did not tell Nathaniel. She was not ready to tell Nathaniel. And she was not entirely sure why, except that telling him felt like handing him something that would make him feel responsible. And she did not want him to feel responsible. This was her life, her name, her business. But Margaret knew something had happened. Margaret had a way of reading a room that was almost supernatural, and that evening when Nathaniel had gone out to the barn to check on a calf that had been off its feed, Margaret set down her mending and said, without preamble, "What happened in town?" Clara told her. Margaret listened without interrupting. Her expression did not change significantly, but her hands stilled on the mending in her lap. and that stillness was its own kind of response. Patience Wells and Dorothy Crane, Margaret said. When Clara finished, not a question, I didn't get their names. I know their voices, Margaret said flatly. I've known those two women for 30 years, and in 30 years they have not found a situation too private to comment on, or a story too incomplete to tell. She picked up her mending again. Pay them no mind, Clara. I'm not paying them mind, Clara said. I'm paying attention to what they represent. Margaret looked at her. The town is going to have an opinion, Clarissa said. It already has one. And whatever I do next, whatever either of us does next, it's going to be done in full view of that opinion. She kept her voice level. I need you to tell me honestly, Margaret. What does this look like from the outside? Margaret was quiet for a long moment. She was not a woman who answered important questions carelessly. From the outside, she said finally, it looks like exactly what those women said. A woman who came to marry one brother and is staying on with the other one. She paused. From the inside, it looks like two people who have been completely honest with each other about a very difficult situation and are trying to navigate it with some dignity. She looked at Clara directly. The question is whether you care more about the outside or the inside. I care about both, Clara said. That's the honest answer. Good, Margaret said. Anyone who tells you they don't care what people think is either lying or a fool. The trick is knowing which opinions matter and which ones are just noise. She picked up her needle. Patience Wells is noise. Dorothy Crane is noise. The people in this town who matter are the ones who will wait and see before they decide. She paused. And Nathaniel is not the kind of man people overlook forever. They've just been doing it for so long they've forgotten to stop. Clara sat with that. He's been overlooked a long time, she said. His whole life, Margaret said. Benjamin was. She stopped. She chose her words with care. The way you do when you love someone, and are also clear-eyed about them. Benjamin filled a room. He was the kind of man people turned to look at when he came through a door. Nathaniel is the kind of man who makes sure the door is working properly before anyone comes through it. She looked at her mending. One of those is more visible. The other one is more necessary. Clara was quiet. Outside, she could hear Nathaniel coming back from the barn, the particular rhythm of his boots across the yard. Unhurried, steady, the way he moved through everything. Margaret, she said before he reached the door. Did you know? About the letters? Margaret did not answer immediately. I suspected, she said. Benjamin wasn't when he read me sections sometimes. The language wasn't quite his. Too precise, too careful. She looked up. I didn't ask. Maybe I should have. The door opened and Nathaniel came in, and the conversation closed itself as naturally as a book being set down. And they spent the rest of the evening, in the usual way, Nathaniel working at the table. Margaret mending, Clara reading, except that something had shifted in the room in the way things shift after an important truth has been spoken in a space. Even after the words themselves are done. The trouble that had been building in town broke 3 days later. Clara heard it from Nathaniel first, which was not how she expected it. He came in from the morning chores earlier than usual. And he sat down at the kitchen table and he said, I need to tell you something, with the particular directness of a man who has decided to stop waiting for the right moment. Clara sat down. She waited. I went into Holt's store this morning, he said. Henderson was there. The Reverend. He looked at his hands. He said he'd had some people come to him. Concerned people. He said, about the situation at the ranch. He paused. He was respectful about it. He's not a bad man. But he said there was talk, and he thought I ought to know. What kind of talk? Clara said. Nathaniel looked up at her. The kind that puts your name in it, he said. In ways you don't deserve. Clara sat with that for a moment. What did you say to him? She said. I said you were a guest in this house. A woman who had been treated poorly by circumstances and who deserved the time to make her own decisions without the town making them for her. He paused. He seemed to accept that, for now, Clara said. Small towns don't hold patience long, he said. They'll want a category to put this in. Either you're a grieving almost bride who we're helping in a time of need, or you're something else. They'll decide which, and they'll decide soon. And whatever they decide will follow your name in this town for a long time. Clara looked at him. And what do you want them to decide, she said. He met her eyes. That's not my decision to make, he said. It's yours. I'm not asking what decision to make, she said. I'm asking what you want. The kitchen was very quiet. Nathaniel looked at her for a long time. She watched something move through him, the thing he was always keeping still. The thing she could see working behind his eyes, and then, slowly, he said, I want you to stay, not as a guest. Not as a convenience of circumstance. He stopped. I want you to stay because you want to be here. And I want this town to know that what happened, all of it. The letters, the truth, everything, I want them to know it honestly. Because your name doesn't deserve to be anyone's gossip. And I'm not willing to hide behind half a story to protect myself. Clara looked at him. You'd tell them, she said. The whole thing. If you'll let me, he said. Yes. That'll make it worse before it makes it better, she said. Yes, he said. Probably. People won't understand it right away. Probably not, they'll have opinions. They already do, he said. At least this way the opinions would be about something real. Clara stood up. She walked to the window. She stood there with her arms crossed, and she looked out at the yard, and she thought about Pennsylvania and about the boarding house, and about a life so small that she had answered an advertisement in a newspaper just to feel like something was possible. She thought about a stone in a pocket getting smoother over time. She thought about a man who said, I have been afraid my whole life that everything I am is only useful to other people. She turned around. Not yet, she said. He looked at her. Not yet, she said again. I'm not ready, and I don't want you to do it for me. I don't want to be something that happens to you. If we tell this town the truth, we do it because we've decided something. Together, she looked at him steadily, and we haven't decided anything yet. No, he said. We haven't, she said. And while we wait, I want you to answer me something honestly. All right, he said. In the letters, she said. The one about grief, the stone in the pocket. Was that about Benjamin? About losing him before you knew you were going to? He looked at her. Something changed in his face, something opened that was usually kept shut. My father, he said. It was about my father. He was sick for 2 years before he died. 2 years of watching someone you love disappear a little at a time. He paused. I wrote that letter at 2 a.m, sitting at this table. Benjamin had asked me to answer your question about your mother, and I couldn't. I didn't know how to answer it for him. So I answered it for myself and I sent it. Clara looked at him for a long moment. That's the truest thing in all 43 letters, she said quietly. He said nothing. That's what I felt when I read it the first time, she said. I thought this man understands grief the way I understand it. The exact shape of it. She paused. Now I know why. Clara, I'm not saying that to punish you, she said. I'm saying it so you understand what you gave me. Even through someone else's name, you gave me something real. She held his gaze. And I'm going to need some time to figure out what to do with that. Take it, he said. All of it, she nodded once. She left the kitchen. She went upstairs and sat on the edge of her bed, and she pressed both hands flat on the quilt, and she counted her own breathing until it was steady. She was not going to cry. She was also, she realized, not pretending not to feel anything. That was new. The weeks that followed had the peculiar quality of a wound that is healing painful in a different way than it was before. The pain moving from sharp and immediate to something duller and more complicated. Clara could feel herself changing, though she could not have said precisely into what. She rode Agnes every morning now without Nathaniel walking beside her. She had learned enough to go out along the creek path alone. And she did, and those morning rides were the part of the day she guarded most fiercely, the particular quiet of moving through open country, with nothing required of her, except to stay on the horse and pay attention. She was paying attention to a great many things. She was paying attention to the way Nathaniel treated the ranch hands, not like a foreman performing authority, but like a man who understood that respect was something you demonstrated rather than demanded. She saw him cover for a young hand named Thomas, who had been sick 3 days running, doing the man's work silently and without mentioning it to anyone. She saw him spend an hour on a Sunday afternoon repairing the fence around the kitchen garden, not ranch fence. Household fence, the kind of work that nobody would notice or credit him for. She saw him read, in the evenings, from a stack of books that lived on the floor beside his chair, serious books, history and philosophy, and once a thick volume on the geology of the Montana Basin that she recognized immediately and looked at him sharply over. He saw her looking. "I told you it was worth knowing," he said. "You told me it was worth knowing," she said. "Apparently you already knew." Something almost like amusement moved across his face. "I wrote about it in a letter once." "I remember the letter," she said. They held each other's eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then Clara looked back at her book, and Nathaniel looked back at his. And Margaret, at the end of the room, continued mending, without comment, though her needle had stopped moving for a moment. The crisis, when it came on a Sunday. Clara had gone to the church service in town. She had been going every Sunday since the second week, because she was a woman who had been raised to value Sunday mornings, and because she was not going to let the Patience Welleses of Red Hollow push her out of a church. She sat in the third pew from the back on the left side, and she listened to Reverend Henderson's sermon with the attentiveness of someone who is partly listening to the sermon and partly listening to everything else in the room. She felt the shift before she understood it. There was a change in the quality of attention being paid to her, something that tightened rather than simply watched. She kept her eyes forward until the service ended, and then she stood and turned and found herself facing, in the aisle, a man she had not seen before, broad-shouldered, somewhere past 50, with the look of someone whose authority in this town was something he had never had to announce because everyone already knew it. "Miss Whitmore," he said, but not softly either. "Harold Deakins. I own the bank on the main street." He paused. "I was a friend of Benjamin's, Mr. Deakins," she said. "I want to say this respectfully," he said, "because I believe you deserve respect. But there are people in this town, good people, people who thought a great deal of Benjamin Caldwell, who are troubled by the current arrangement out at the Caldwell place." He looked at her directly. "It would put a lot of minds at ease if you could tell us what your intentions are." The church had not emptied. People were moving slowly, creating reasons to take longer than necessary to put on their coats and collect their children, and generally be somewhere in earshot of this conversation. Clara was aware of every single one of them. She looked at Harold Deakins. "My intentions," she said clearly, in a voice that carried without being raised, "are to conduct myself with honesty and decency in a situation that I did not choose and that has required a great deal from everyone involved." She paused. "I don't believe my intentions are any business of the town's, Mr. Deakins. But since you've asked respectfully, I've answered respectfully." Deakins looked at her for a moment. "People will talk," he said. "People are already talking," she said. "They were talking before I said a word. I reckon they'll talk regardless of what I do. So I might as well do what's right and let them get on with it." She looked at him for one more second. Then she put on her gloves, said good morning to the room in general, and walked out of the church and did not stop walking until she reached the road. Behind her she heard clearly, in the silence before the church noise resumed, one person clapping, just one, slow and deliberate. She did not turn to see who it was. She walked back to the ranch and she was halfway across the yard when the wagon came in behind her. And Nathaniel climbed down and tied off the horses. And when he turned and saw her face, he stopped. "What happened?" he said. "Nothing I couldn't handle," she said. "Clara." She stopped. He almost never said her name. He was careful with it, used it rarely enough that when he did, it felt like something being handed over deliberately. She turned around. "A man named Deakins," she said. "In the church. He asked about my intentions. Something hardened in Nathaniel's face. Quietly, without drama, like a temperature dropping. "What did you say?" he said. "I said it was none of the town's business." And I answered him anyway, and I left. She looked at him. "He's going to keep pushing. The town is going to keep pushing." "You know that, I know it," he said. "So we need to decide," she said. "You and I, not because the town is pushing us. Because it's time." He looked at her steadily. "What are you saying?" he said. Clara stood in the yard of the Caldwell Ranch on a Sunday morning in October of 1874. With the Montana wind coming in cold from the north, and the sound of cattle in the south pasture, and a spotted dog sleeping by the water trough. And she looked at the man in front of her, this quiet, strange, deeply honest man, who had been writing her love letters under his dead brother's name for 11 months, and she said, "I'm saying I didn't cross 2,000 miles to let Harold Deakins or Patience Wells or Dorothy Crane write the end of my story." She paused. "And I'm saying I need you to go into town and tell them the truth. All of it. The letters. The whole thing. Before someone else tells a worse version." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. "And after I do that," he said carefully, "what happens?" Clara held his eyes. "I don't know yet," she said. "But whatever it is, it'll be honest. And that's worth more to me than comfortable." He stood there in the yard, looking at her, and she could see him making a decision, not a small one. Not a careful, considered, hedged decision, but a real one. The kind a person makes when they have been building toward it for a long time, without fully admitting it. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. She went inside. She sat at the kitchen table, and she pressed her hands flat on the surface, and she listened to the sound of Nathaniel hitching the wagon back up, the particular sounds of a man preparing to go somewhere with something important to do, and she held onto the edge of the table, and she told herself she was not afraid. She was afraid, but underneath the fear, steady and specific and entirely her own, was something she recognized at last as the feeling she had been looking for since the moment she stepped off a train on a Thursday afternoon in August and found nobody waiting. It was not happiness exactly. It was not certainty. It was something quieter than both and more durable. It felt like standing on solid ground for the first time in a very long time. And she held on to it with both hands. Nathaniel drove into Red Hollow that same Sunday afternoon. Clara heard the wagon leave. She sat at the kitchen table and did not move for a long time, listening to the sound of it get smaller and smaller until there was nothing left but the ordinary noises of the ranch wind. Cattle, biscuit shifting in the yard, and the particular silence of a house that is waiting for something to happen. Margaret came in from the back room and looked at her. "He went to town," Margaret said. It was not a question. "Yes," Clara said. Margaret sat down. She folded her hands on the table. "To tell them." Yes, Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said good, and got up and put the kettle on. And that was all she said about it, and Clara found she was more grateful for that than she could have easily expressed. They drank tea, and they did not talk much, and the afternoon light moved across the kitchen floor, the way it always did, and the house held its breath right along with Clara. Nathaniel came back 2 hours later. He came through the door and hung his hat and sat down at the table. And his face was set in a way Clara had not seen before, not closed. Exactly, but stripped of the usual careful containment. The way a wall looks after something has hit it. Still standing. "Marked, I told them," he said. "Who is them?" Clara said. "Henderson first, then Deakins." He looked at his hands. "Henderson called 3 of the Deakins in. I told all of them. Everything. The letters from the beginning. Why I started helping Benjamin. When it became something different. What I sent and what I meant by it." He stopped. "I told them you didn't know. That you arrived here believing everything you had been told. That you are entirely without fault in this." And Clara said. He looked up at her. "Henderson said he appreciated my honesty," Nathaniel said. "Deacon said it was the most irregular situation he'd encountered in 30 years in this town." He paused. Then Deacon said that Benjamin always did have trouble putting words to things, and that if he'd asked for help, that was his own business. And the question now was what happened next. "What did you say?" Clara said. "I said that was up to you," he said. "I said I had no intention of pressuring you in any direction, and that I had come to tell them the truth, because your name deserved the truth behind it. And whatever you decided after that, the town would know the facts and could form its opinion accordingly." Clara sat with that. "How did Deacons take it?" she said. "He shook my hand," Nathaniel said. Something like surprise was still in his voice. He said that whatever I'd done wrong in the start of it, coming in today and saying it plainly was the right thing. And he said Benjamin always trusted my judgment, and maybe he'd trusted it in this too." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "I didn't know what to do with that. Did you say so?" "I said I appreciated it, and I left before I could say something else." Clara almost smiled. She caught it, but only just. "And Henderson," she said. "Henderson said he'd speak to his congregation. He said he couldn't make people think a certain way, but he could ask them to extend some Christian patience while a difficult situation was handled decently." He looked at her directly. "He also said, and I want to tell you this because it matters, he said that whatever came next between you and me, he would be available to talk, to both of us if we wanted." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "He's a wiser man than I gave him credit for," she said. "Most people are," Nathaniel said, "when you give them something real to work with." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the particular silence of two people who have just cleared a significant piece of ground between them and are standing looking at it, not quite sure what to build there yet. Then Margaret set a plate of biscuits in the center of the table and said, "Eat something, both of you, before you give me worry lines I haven't earned." And Clara did smile at that. And Nathaniel looked at his mother with an expression that was the closest thing to openly fond she had seen from him. And something in the room changed, not dramatically, but definitively the way a season changes, not all at once. But the direction becomes clear. The town's reaction came in pieces. Some of them were expected. Patience Wells and Dorothy Crane were seen the following Tuesday at the post office having what appeared to be a very animated conversation that stopped when Clara walked past. And Clara nodded pleasantly to both of them and kept walking. And she did not look back to see their expressions, because she had decided some time ago that the expressions of women who whisper in stores were not a useful thing to spend her attention on. What she had not expected was the ones who came toward her. On Wednesday morning, a woman named Frances Holt, Mr. Holt's wife from the general store, appeared at the ranch and asked to speak to Clara. Clara brought her inside, and Margaret made coffee, and Frances Holt sat at the kitchen table with her cup and said, "Without preamble, I just want you to know that my husband and I don't hold with the gossip. What I've heard about your situation from Reverend Henderson, not from the rumor mill, well, it seems to me like everybody in it was doing the best they knew how under difficult circumstances. And I've lived long enough to know that's the most you can ask of anybody." Clara looked at her. "Thank you, Mrs. Holt," she said. "Frances," the woman said immediately. "And I'm not saying this to be kind. I'm saying it because it's true. And because you look like a woman who appreciates the difference." She did appreciate the difference. She said so. Frances Holt became, in the weeks that followed, the first person outside the Caldwell Ranch who treated the situation as something other than a scandal to be managed or a tragedy to be mourned. She treated it as a thing that had happened to real people, which was what it was, and that simple clarity of view turned out to be worth more than any number of charitable pronouncements from people performing goodwill. But it was the other thing that came in that same week that changed the direction of everything. A letter arrived. It came on a Thursday in the regular post, addressed to Miss Clara Whitmore, care of the Caldwell Ranch, Red Hollow, Montana Territory. The handwriting on the envelope was unfamiliar. The return address was Philadelphia. Clara opened it at the kitchen table. It was from her aunt, her mother's sister, a woman named Ruth Kavanaugh. who had run the boarding house where Clara had lived for the past 6 years and who had been the closest thing to family Clara had left in the world. Which was to say, not very close at all. Ruth Kavanagh was a woman who operated at the intersection of duty and grievance, and she wrote in precisely that spirit. The letter said, in 4 pages, the following things: that she had heard from a mutual acquaintance that Clara had arrived in Montana only to find the man she had meant to marry was deceased. That this was a terrible situation and Ruth was very sorry for it. That Clara should come home immediately. That staying in the house of a single man who was not her husband was improper and would damage her reputation irreparably. That at 31, Clara could not afford further damage to her prospects. That there was a position available at the boarding house for a respectable woman of good character who understood the value of a quiet life. That Ruth would advance the cost of the train ticket if Clara would promise to repay it within the year. Clara read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully, put it back in the envelope, and sat very still at the kitchen table. Nathaniel was at the other end of the table, doing something with a harness that needed repair. He had not looked up when the letter arrived, had not watched her read it, was not watching her now. He was very carefully not watching her, which was its own kind of attention. "My aunt wants me to come back to Philadelphia," Clara said. He set down the harness. "She says staying here is improper," Clara said. "She says she has a position for me at the boarding house. She says at 31 I cannot afford to damage my prospects further." Nathaniel looked at her. He said nothing. "She is not wrong," Clara said, "about the improper part. Not by the standards most people are using." "No," he said. "She's not wrong about that. And she's not wrong that I'm 31, Clara said. "No," he said. "She is wrong," Clara said, "about the quiet life." He looked at her steadily. "I spent 6 years in that boarding house," she said. "I know exactly what a quiet life looks like. It looks like mending other people's dresses and being grateful for the opportunity." She set the letter flat on the table. "I would rather be improper in Montana than respectable in Pennsylvania. That's not a complicated calculation." Something happened in Nathaniel's face, something that moved through it fast, like light through water. "What are you saying?" he said carefully. "I'm saying I'm not going back," she said. "Not to Philadelphia. Not to Ruth Kavanagh. Not to the version of my life that letter is offering me." She looked at him. "I'm saying I need to know if there's a reason to stay here. A real one. Not as a guest and not as a charity case and not as someone the town is watching to see what she'll do next." The harness sat on the table between them. Outside, the wind came in from the north and pushed against the house. Nathaniel said very quietly, "You know there's a reason. I know you wrote me 43 letters," she said. "I know you've been honest with me about hard things. I know you put a music box on my windowsill and sweet pea seeds under my door, and you've never once made me feel like a problem to be managed." She held his eyes. "I want to hear you say it plainly, not in a letter. Not through anyone's name but your own." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I love you. I have for a long time. And in a way I'm not proud of the beginning of, but the thing itself is real. You are the person I have most wanted to be honest with in my entire life. And I have wanted every day since you arrived to deserve the right to say that to your face." He stopped. "That's as plain as I know how to say it." Clara looked at him across the kitchen table. "That," she said, "is the first thing you've ever said to me that I didn't have to wonder about. I mean, for it to be the first of many," he said. "Good," she said. "Then we understand each other." She picked up her aunt's letter. She folded it once more. She got up and put it in the fire. Nathaniel watched her do it. "Clary," said. She turned. "If you're staying," he said, "I want to do this right. I want to speak to Henderson. I want to court you properly. In full view of this town. No more half stories. No more managing what people see." She looked at him for a moment. "You want to court me," she said. "Yes, we've been living in the same house for 2 months. I'm aware of that," he said. "I still want to do it right." Something shifted in Clara, something warm and complicated that she had been holding at arm's length for weeks. "All right," she said. "Then do it right." What followed was, by any external measure, the most unusual courtship Red Hollow had ever witnessed. Nathaniel did not pretend the situation was ordinary. Because it was not ordinary, and he had committed to honesty with such thoroughness that pretense of any kind seemed to be physically beyond him. He called on Clara in his own house, with the formal deliberateness of a man who understood that the ritual mattered not because of appearances, but because she deserved to be chosen openly. In full daylight, in front of everyone, he brought her things. Not extravagant things, he was not an extravagant man. He brought her a copy of a geology survey of the Montana Basin that he had ordered from a bookseller in Billings, because she had been genuinely fascinated by the geology book, and he had remembered it. He brought her early in the morning from the south field a handful of the last autumn wildflowers not arranged, not prettified, just brought with the directness of a man who thought flowers were flowers, and the giving of them was what mattered. He asked her questions and listened to the answers with the kind of attention that is rare enough in anyone that it consistently caught her off guard, the way he would come back the next day and reference something she'd said, having turned it over in the interim, having thought about it. He thought about everything she said. She had not experienced that before. Not from a man, not steadily, not without it being in the service of something he wanted from her. Nathaniel seemed to want from her simply her opinion on the geology survey, her reaction to a letter he'd received from a cattle buyer in Billings, her preference for where the fence line in the kitchen garden should go. He asked her things that had no right answer and listened to what she said as if it was useful information about someone whose mind he was genuinely interested in. It was, she thought, the most purely respectful thing anyone had ever done to her. And it was also quietly devastating, because she had not known. This was a thing she'd been missing until she was standing in the middle of it. It was Francis Holt who told her, 3 weeks into the courtship, that the town was coming around. Not all of it, Francis said. Directly, because Francis was a woman who believed in accurate reporting. Patience Wells is still performing moral outrage for anyone who'll watch. But Deacon said something at the town meeting on Monday that I think you ought to know. What did he say? Clara said. He said that Benjamin Caldwell was his friend for 20 years, and that Benjamin would not have wanted his death to leave a woman stranded, with nowhere to go. And that Nathaniel handling the situation with honesty and decency was exactly the kind of thing that made the Caldwells the kind of family this town should be glad to have in it. Francis paused. He also said that anyone who had a problem with it was welcome to bring their business to any other bank. Clara stared at her. Harold Deacon said that? He is a more complicated man than he seems, Francis said pleasantly. Most people are. That evening, Clara told Nathaniel what Deacons had said. Nathaniel was quiet for a long time. That was generous of him, he said finally. He meant it, Clara said. I think he's decided you're worth backing. Nathaniel looked at her with something in his face that was rawer than usual, less controlled. I'm not used to that, he said. Not with self-pity. Just as a fact. I know, she said. You should probably get used to it. He looked at her. You're deciding something, he said. He could read her. He had always been able to read her. She realized, even before she knew who was reading. I've already decided, she said. I decided when I burned the letter. She held his gaze. I'm asking you now to make it official. In front of Henderson. In front of Deacons. In front of every person in this town who has had an opinion about my name since August. He did not look away. You're sure, he said. I've never been less uncertain about anything in my life, she said. And I've done uncertain for a very long time, Nathaniel. I'm done with it. He stood up from the table. He crossed to where she was standing. He was not a demonstrative man, she knew that, had known it from the beginning, so when he took her hand in both of his, it was not a small thing. It was from him, an enormous thing. And she felt the weight of it and held it. Clara Whitmore, he said. With the directness he brought to everything, will you marry me? Not because the town needs an answer. Not because the situation requires it. Because I want to spend the rest of my life being honest with you. And I want to do that with your permission and your name. She looked at him for exactly one moment. Yes, she said. With one condition, name it, he said. You never write a letter for someone else again, she said. Whatever you need to say, you say it in your own name. To me, always, something moved through his face, pain and release at the same time. The way it looks when something that has been held too tight finally gets to let go. That, he said, I can promise. Then yes, she said. That's my answer. What happened next moved faster than Clara had expected, or perhaps it only felt fast because she had spent so long standing still. Nathaniel spoke to Reverend Henderson that week. Henderson, who had proven himself by this point to be genuinely more interested in the welfare of his congregation than in its performance of propriety, received the news with what Clara could only describe as measured gladness, the kind that doesn't perform itself but simply is. I'll marry you, he said to them both when they sat across from him in the small room behind the church. Gladly. And I want to say something to both of you first. He looked at Nathaniel. You did something hard in coming in here and telling the truth. It would have been easier not to. A great many men would have chosen easier. Then he looked at Clara. And you did something harder, in my estimation, which is staying when you had every right and reason to leave. That says more about your character than any circumstance you arrived in. He folded his hands. This marriage has an unusual beginning, but I have performed ceremonies for couples who had perfectly ordinary beginnings and perfectly empty hearts. And I'll take unusual over empty any day. Clara gripped Nathaniel's hand under the edge of the desk. He gripped back. The trouble when it came, and Clara had known it would come. Because nothing in her life had ever resolved cleanly, came 4 days later. And it came from a direction she had not anticipated. She came downstairs one morning to find Margaret at the kitchen table with a letter in her hands and an expression on her face that Clara had not seen before. Not grief. Margaret wore grief in a particular way that Clara recognized by now. This was something different, older. What is it? Clara said. Margaret looked up. She set the letter down. It's from my sister, she said. In Billings. She's heard about the situation here. From whom? I don't know, but word travels. She paused. She says I'm making a mistake letting this go forward. She says I'm betraying Benjamin's memory by allowing Nathaniel to... She stopped. Her hands were very still on the table. Clara sat down. What do you believe? Clara said. Margaret looked at her directly. I believe my sister has not spent 5 minutes in this house with you and Nathaniel. I believe she's making a judgment from the outside about something she cannot see from there. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were not entirely dry. I believe that Benjamin would have been glad. Not immediately, it would have hurt him. I don't pretend otherwise. But in the long run, he wanted something real for Nathaniel. He said so to me more than once. He said Nathaniel spent his whole life making room for other people and never taking up any for himself. Clara said nothing. She let that sit. Margaret pressed her lips together. I want to make sure. I need you to look at me and tell me that this is real. Not circumstance. Not the only available option. She held Clara's eyes. Real. Clara held her gaze without flinching. It's the realest thing I've had since my mother died, she said. I want you to know that. I want you to know I did not come here to fill a vacancy. I'm not here because there was nowhere else to go. She paused. I'm here because your son, not Benjamin, though I grieve him. I grieve the possibility of him. Your son Nathaniel is the only man who has ever spoken to me like my mind was worth the effort. She paused. And I intend to spend a considerable amount of time making sure he knows that matters. Margaret looked at her for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and put her hand over Clara's. Good, she said. Her voice was not entirely steady. That's what I needed to hear. They sat that way for a moment. The two of them, in the quiet kitchen. Then Margaret took her hand back and straightened and said, I'll write Eleanor back this afternoon and tell her to mind her business." And Clara laughed, really laughed. The kind that comes up from somewhere genuine, and Margaret looked very slightly pleased with herself. And that was that. But the hardest moment came that evening. Nathaniel came in late from the far pasture. Clara could tell from the set of him, when he came through the door, that something had happened. He hung his hat, he sat down. He said nothing for a long moment. And Clara waited, because she had learned that with Nathaniel, waiting was always worth it. "Thomas quit today," he said finally. Thomas, the young ranch hand he'd been covering for all autumn. "Why?" Clara said. Nathaniel looked at the table. "His family has been hearing things. In town. About the situation here." He paused. "His mother told him he ought not to be working for a man who'd behave the way people are saying I behaved." Clara felt the anger move through her. Clean and immediate. "What people are saying you behaved," she said. "That I took advantage," he said. "Of Benjamin's death. Of your situation. That he stopped. The particular version of the story that Patience Wells is telling does not have me in a flattering light." "What specifically?" Clara said. "That I wrote those letters, intending to deceive you from the beginning," he said. "That Benjamin was never truly interested in correspondence, and I ran the whole thing myself to bring a woman here for my own purposes." He looked at her. I know it's not true," Clara said. "I know you do," he said. "But Thomas didn't." He was quiet for a moment. "And he's not the only one who'll hear it and believe it. It's a better story than the true one, simpler." Clara stood up. She walked to the window. She stood there and she breathed deliberately, the way she had learned to do when anger wanted to become something less useful. "Nathaniel," she said. "Yes." She turned around. "You could have let me leave," she said. "When I arrived, you could have handed me train fare and wished me well, and no one would have said a word." "Yes," he said. "You could have told Henderson a simpler version," she said. "Kept enough back that the town had a tidier story to accept." "Yes," he said. "You did the harder thing every time," she said. "Every single time. You chose the harder thing." She looked at him. "So do not sit at this table and let Patience Wells' version of you become the one you believe about yourself. Not in front of me." He looked at her. Something in his face broke open, not dramatically. Not with tears or visible collapse, but in the way a very old tension releases. Quietly. "I don't know how you do that," he said. "Do what?" she said. "See through to the right thing," he said. "Every time. Like it's not even difficult." "It's very difficult," she said. "I'm just loud about it." He looked at her for a long moment. Then, for the first time since she had arrived at the Caldwell Ranch on a Thursday afternoon in August, with a broken clasped travel bag and nowhere to be, Nathaniel Caldwell smiled, not a small, careful expression. A real one, the kind that changes a person's whole face. That shows you what they looked like before they learned to be so careful. Clara looked at that smile. She thought, there you are. She had been waiting to see it, she realized, since the beginning. Since the platform. Since the storm. Since the kitchen table and the 43 letters and every small, honest, carefully offered thing in between. There was the man who had written those letters. Right there, looking at her. She did not say any of that. She sat back down at the table. She poured him coffee from the pot on the stove. She set it in front of him, and she said, "Drink that. We have a wedding to plan, and I am not letting Patience Wells ruin it." And Nathaniel Caldwell wrapped both hands around the cup she had put in front of him and looked at her over the rim of it and said, quietly, with that real smile still present at the edges, "No, ma'am, good," she said, and outside the Montana wind came in cold from the north, and the cattle moved in the south pasture, and Biscuit shifted by the door, and the old Caldwell ranch held all of it, the grief and the honesty and the unlikely. Stubborn, entirely real thing growing in the kitchen, held all of it the way a good house holds weather. Solid at the bones, built to last. The wedding was set for the second Saturday in November. Clara had not wanted anything elaborate. Not because she couldn't imagine it. She had imagined weddings the way all women of her generation were trained to. in careful, hopeful detail, but because elaborate felt dishonest for this particular beginning. And if there was one thing she and Nathaniel had committed to, with the thoroughness of people who had learned the hard way what dishonesty costs, it was that nothing about them was going to be performed. She told Nathaniel this on a Wednesday evening, 2 weeks before the date. "Small," she said, "just family, Henderson. Francis and Mr. Holt if they want to come. That's all." Nathaniel looked at her across the table. "You're sure? You don't want— I want it to be real," she said. "Real is small, real is honest. Real doesn't need an audience." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. What neither of them anticipated was that Red Hollow had its own ideas about what the wedding should look like. It started with Frances Holt, who appeared at the ranch on Thursday morning, with a bolt of fabric under her arm and the expression of a woman who has made a decision and is not particularly interested in discussing it. "I'm making you a dress," she said to Clara. "Don't argue. I've been sewing for 30 years, and I've never made a wedding dress, and I am not going to miss my chance because you've decided am I modest about it." Clara looked at the fabric. It was a deep cream color, heavier than muslin, with a subtle texture that caught the light. "Frances, it'll take me 10 days, Frances said. "You'll have it by the Friday before. I just need your measurements and your preferences. And if you say your preference is nothing special, I will ignore that completely and do what I think is right." Clara looked at her for a long moment. "Something simple," she said finally. "Clean lines. Nothing that gets in the way." Frances smiled. "That I can work with." That was the dress. The food arrived the following Monday from a woman named Ada Burgess, who ran the boarding house in town and who stood at the ranch door with her teenage daughter and the information that she would be providing the wedding supper, that she did not require payment, and that if anyone objected, they could discuss it with her husband, who was 6'3" and had very little patience for objections. Clara did not object. Margaret, who had been trying to manage the wedding supper herself for 2 weeks, looked at Ada Burgess with an expression that was equal parts relief and gratitude and said, "I'll make the biscuits." And Ada said, "Deal." And that was settled. Nathaniel watched all of this unfold from a careful distance with an expression Clara could not quite read until one evening when he came in from the barn to find 3 women she had never seen before, sitting in the main room helping. Margaret with some decorative sewing dried flowers. Ribbon, the particular industry of women, preparing a space for a ceremony, and he stopped in the doorway and looked at the room full of people, and then looked at Clara. "I thought you wanted it small," he said quietly. "I did," she said. "It turns out the town had other plans." He looked around the room again. At Margaret, laughing at something one of the women had said. At the dried flowers in a basket by the fireplace. At the general, bustling, entirely uninvited warmth of people deciding something mattered enough to show up for. "Why?" he said, not rhetorical, genuinely asking. Clara looked at him. "Because you went in there and told them the truth," she said. "And because the truth turned out to be something they could respect." She paused. "People don't always reward honesty, but when they do, they show up with fabric and food and dried flowers, and apparently they bring extra women." Something crossed his face that he didn't try to control. "I don't know what to do with this," he said. "You say thank you," she said. "And you eat whatever Ada Burgess puts in front of you, and you mean it." He looked at her for a moment. "You're very good at this," he said. "At what?" she said. "At knowing what things mean," he said. "At understanding people." She looked at him. "You're better at it than you think. You just don't give yourself credit for what you see." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he went over and said hello to the women in the sitting room. And Margaret looked at him with an expression that Clara would carry with her for the rest of her life, that particular maternal happiness that is also a kind of relief. The look of a woman watching her child finally receive something she always knew he deserved. The night before the wedding, Clara could not sleep. She lay in the dark in the room at the top of the stairs, her room. The room she had slept in since August. The room she would leave tomorrow to move into the larger room at the end of the hall that had been Benjamin's, and that Nathaniel had spent 2 weeks quietly preparing without telling her and without making a production of it, and she stared at the ceiling and she let herself feel all of it at once. The grief first. She did not flinch from it. Benjamin Caldwell was a man she had never met, and she was about to marry in a church half a mile from his grave. And there was grief in that grief for a possibility, for a future that had been genuine, even if the version of it she'd imagined was not quite accurate. She let herself feel it fully, and she said in the dark, "To no one in particular, I'm sorry. For what you lost. For what we might have been. I'm sorry." Then she let it go. Not because it didn't matter, because it had to be put down to pick up what was next. She reached over to the windowsill and wound the music box. The small, gentle sound filled the room, and she lay listening to it until it wound down. And then she lay in the quiet, and she thought about 43 letters and a tin box, and a woman who had answered an advertisement in a newspaper because she had nothing left to lose. And how that woman was going to wake up tomorrow morning and get married. Not to the man she had set out to marry, to the one she was supposed to find. She did not know if she believed in supposed to. She was not certain the universe arranged things with that kind of intention. But she believed in this, that the most real things in her life had come from following what was honest even when it was hard. And that Nathaniel Caldwell was the most honest thing she had encountered in 31 years. And that was enough. That was more than enough. She slept. She dreamed about nothing in particular. She woke up to Margaret knocking softly on the door with coffee. And it was her wedding day. The church was fuller than Clara had expected. She stood at the back with Margaret's hand through her arm and looked at the rows of people, not the entire town. Not anything like it, but more than she had anticipated, and she breathed once, deliberately, and stood straight. Frances Holt's dress was extraordinary. Clara had said clean lines and simple, and Frances had heard both those things and added her own third thing, which was dignity, and the result was something that made Clara look, for the first time in her life, exactly like herself at her best. Not adorned, just clarified. "Ready?" Margaret said. Clara looked at the front of the church. Nathaniel was standing at the altar with Henderson, and he had his back half turned to the door. And then someone must have said something because he turned. And he saw her, and what happened to his face in that moment was not something Clara would ever describe to anyone, because some things are not for describing. They are for keeping, she said. Ready. She walked down the aisle. Not slowly, in the way of women performing entrance. She walked the way she walked everywhere, purposefully. Like a woman who has somewhere to be and means to get there. Several people in the pews smiled at that, without knowing quite why. And Frances Holt, who knew exactly why, pressed her lips together with satisfaction. Nathaniel held out his hand when she reached him. She took it. His hand was steady. So was hers. Henderson said, "We are gathered here in the presence of God and this community to witness the marriage of Nathaniel James Caldwell and Clara Ann Whitmore. This marriage has not come about through ordinary means. It has come about through loss and honesty, and the particular courage of two people who chose truth over convenience at every step of a very difficult road." He paused. "In my experience, marriages that begin that way are built on a foundation that holds." Someone in the second row made a sound that might have been agreement. "Do you, Nathaniel James Caldwell," Henderson said, "take this woman as your wife, to have and to hold, in honesty and in difficulty, and in whatever ordinary and extraordinary days come after this one?" Nathaniel looked at Clara. "I do," he said, and then without it being part of the ceremony, without it being prompted by Henderson or tradition or expectation, he said, "I should have found my own words sooner. I'm going to spend the rest of my life making that right." Clara looked at him. She felt the burn at the back of her eyes, and she decided she was absolutely allowed to feel it. "And do you, Clara Ann Whitmore," Henderson said, "take this man as your husband, to have and to hold in honesty and in difficulty and in whatever ordinary and extraordinary days Come after this one, I do, Clara said. I came here looking for someone else. I found you instead. I am glad every day that I didn't understand what that meant until I did. Someone in the church, Clara would later discover, it was Ada Burgess, made a sound like a sob quickly converted into a cough. Then by the authority vested in me, Henderson said, I pronounce you husband and wife. He smiled a real smile. The kind he did not deploy in every ceremony, Nathaniel. You may kiss your wife. Nathaniel looked at her. He was not a demonstrative man. She knew that. The church was full of people, and it was not his natural condition to perform anything in front of an audience. He kissed her anyway, briefly but completely, the kind of kiss that is not a performance but a statement. That says, I am here and this is real and I am not ashamed of any of it. Several people clapped. Harold Deakins in the fourth row nodded once with the expression of a man whose judgment has been confirmed. Patience Wells was not present. Clara noticed this and found she didn't mind at all. The wedding supper at the ranch was by any measure a success. Ada Burgess had outdone herself. Margaret's biscuits were, as always, the best thing on the table. People filled the main room and spilled out to the porch, and talked with the easy warmth of people who have been given a reason to celebrate in a season that needed one. Clara moved through it all with a quality of attention she would think about later, the way you are present at the best moments of your life. Seeing everything sharply, knowing even as it happens that you are going to want to remember exactly this. Frances Holt embraced her at some point during the evening and said, in her ear, I knew the moment you didn't flinch at those women in the store. I knew right then. Knew what? Clara said. That you were the right kind of stubborn, Frances said. This town needed someone like that. Reverend Henderson shook Nathaniel's hand at the door when he left and said, simply, well done, and Nathaniel, who was not accustomed to those words directed at him for something that was not ranch work, looked briefly like he did not know what to do with them, and then said, thank you, Reverend, and meant it. The last guests left near 9 o'clock. Margaret went to bed. She had been on her feet since before dawn, and she was 63 years old, and she was entitled, and suddenly the house was quiet. Nathaniel and Clara sat at the kitchen table in the aftermath of it, in the particular silence that follows a crowded room. And Clara looked at the table with its used cups and the last of the biscuits in the cloth on the board. And she thought, this is ordinary. This is completely ordinary. And it is the best thing I have ever sat in the middle of. You all right? Nathaniel said. More than all right, she said. He looked at her. I need to tell you something, he said. She looked at him. Waited. I found this last week, he said. He reached into his jacket. He was still in his wedding clothes. The good dark jacket he had worn to town, and he put something on the table between them. It was a letter. The handwriting on the envelope was Benjamin's. Clara looked at it. It was in the back of the desk drawer, Nathaniel said. Behind everything. I think he wrote it. I think he wrote it not long before he got sick. It's addressed to me. He paused. I've read it. I want you to read it too. But only if you want to. Clara looked at the envelope for a long moment. Then she picked it up. The letter inside was 2 pages. In Benjamin's rounded, uneven hand. She read it carefully. From beginning to end, Benjamin had written, Nathaniel, I know the letters have been more yours than mine for a long time. I'm not a fool, even if I sometimes act like one. I know you well enough to know that what you've been writing isn't just helping me, it's you. It's the part of you that you never show anyone, because you're always too busy showing up for everyone else. I should have said this sooner, and I didn't, and that's my failure. But I'm saying it now. She sounds like someone worth knowing. Truly. Not the version I'd have made of her if I'd had to do it myself. The version you've found, through her letters, through whatever it is you do, when you actually read what someone writes and take them seriously. If something happens to me, I don't know why I'm writing that. I'm in fine health. It just feels like a thing to say if something happens. Don't send her away. Don't stand behind that headstone of yours and decide you're not the kind of man she came here for. You're exactly the kind of man she came here for. You just don't know it yet. Take care of the ranch, take care of Mama, and for God's sake, Nathaniel, for once in your life, take care of yourself. Clara read it twice. Then she folded it carefully along its original creases and put it back in the envelope and set it on the table between them. She did not trust herself to speak immediately. Nathaniel was watching her. He knew, she said finally. Yes, Nathaniel said. His voice was not entirely steady. He knew, and he didn't say anything. That was Benjamin, Nathaniel said. He'd see the whole board and wait for you to catch up. He paused. He wasn't always patient, but about the things that mattered. He could wait. Clara looked at the envelope. He gave us permission, she said. Before he was even gone. Something like that, Nathaniel said. She looked up at him. There were no words she could locate that were adequate for what she felt in that moment, not grief exactly. Not only happiness, but something that contained both and was larger than either. The feeling of a story that has been going in an unexpected direction arriving. Finally, at a place where you can see the whole shape of it and understand that the unexpected direction was exactly right. She reached across the table. She put her hand over his. He was right about you, she said. In case you didn't know. Nathaniel looked at her hand on his. He was usually right, he said quietly. I just didn't always want to admit it. You should work on that, she said. I have a wife to help me now, he said. She looked at him. That word, wife, said in his voice plainly without drama or performance. Just real. Yes, she said, you do. They sat there at the kitchen table in the quiet of the house that was now theirs together. And outside the Montana wind moved through the grass, and the cattle settled in the south pasture, and Biscuit made one sound at the door, and then went quiet. And it was ordinary, and it was entirely extraordinary, and Clara held on to Nathaniel's hand, and she let herself have it. All of it, without apology, without qualification. Without the waiting and the careful managing and the performance of being all right that had occupied her for so much of her life. She was all right. She was more than all right. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. In a house she had not expected, with a man she had not planned for. On the other side of the hardest autumn of her life. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the whole thing. The letter from Benjamin stayed on the kitchen table that night. Neither of them moved it. In the morning, Clara would fold it into the tin box, with the 43 letters it belonged there. As the 44th, the one that explained everything. The one that had been waiting for her, without her knowing it. But for now, it stayed on the table in the lamplight. And it was the last thing Clara looked at before she blew out the lamp. A man of his word. It said so on his headstone. She believed it now in a way she hadn't been able to believe it before, not because she had known him, but because she had seen what he left behind. The ranch, solid and well-tended. The mother, fierce and loving. The brother, steady and true. And this letter, written to no one but Nathaniel. Given to no one. Kept in a desk drawer where it would only be found by someone looking. By someone who stayed. She had stayed. She had found it. Take care of yourself, he had written. For once in your life. She pressed her fingers briefly against the envelope. She blew out the lamp. She went to bed in her own house on her wedding night, with her husband's steady breathing in the dark beside her. And the Montana wind outside, doing what it always did, moving through everything. Touching nothing for long, passing on. She slept without the music box. She didn't need it anymore. The winter came early, as Margaret had promised it would, without apology. The first snow arrived in the second week of November and settled in for business. Packing down on the ranch road and weighing the fence lines and turning the creek at the north end of the property into something slow and silver and serious. Clara learned to live in Montana winter the way she learned everything, by paying attention. By asking questions she was not embarrassed to ask. By doing things badly first and then better. She asked Nathaniel, on the first real snow morning, to show her how to read the weather coming in from the northwest. He stood beside her at the kitchen window, not touching. Just present in that way he had, close enough that she was entirely aware of him, and he said, "Watch the way the cattle move. Watch how the horses stand. The animals know before the clouds do." She watched the cattle. She learned. She asked Margaret, that same week, to teach her to make the biscuits properly. Margaret looked at her with deep skepticism and said that biscuit making was not something you learned in a week. And Clara said she had the whole winter, and Margaret said, "Fine, but you follow my measurements exactly, no improvising." Clara agreed. She improvised twice in the first session, and both batches were disasters, and she agreed more firmly after that. By January she had it. Margaret tasted one and said, "Acceptable," which from Margaret was effusive praise. And Clara felt a satisfaction so particular and domestic and entirely real that she had to laugh at herself for feeling it. She laughed at herself more in that first winter than she had in the previous 5 years combined. That was Nathaniel's doing, though he would never have claimed credit for it. He was not funny in the way of people who perform humor. He was funny in the way of people who see things clearly and say what they see. And the gap between what they observe and what everyone else is pretending is frequently absurd. He said, one evening in December, watching Biscuit attempt with great dignity to fit himself onto a rug that was approximately 1/3 of his size. "He's done that every evening for 9 years. He's never once fit. He tries anyway." Clara looked at the dog. She looked at Nathaniel. "Is that a metaphor?" she said. "Might be. The rug's probably too small. Doesn't seem to discourage him much." She thought about that for a long time. She thought about it the way she thought about many things, Nathaniel said, storing them carefully, taking them out later, finding new angles in them. He had a way of saying the exact right thing without knowing it was the exact right thing, which she had noticed in the letters long before she knew who was writing them, and which turned out to be even more striking in person because he had no idea he was doing it. She told him this one night in January when the snow was heavy on the roof and the fire was the whole world. "You say true things without knowing you're saying them," she said. He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "In the letters," she said. "And now, you say something that sounds ordinary, and it turns out to be the thing. The actual true thing I needed to hear." He was quiet for a moment. "Benjamin always said I thought too much," he said. "Benjamin was wrong about that one," she said. He looked at her. "You can say that," she said. "He was wrong about some things. People are. You're allowed to notice." He was quiet for a long time. "I know," he said finally. It's a habit. Letting people be right. Break it," she said. He looked at her with that expression she loved, the one that was half exasperation and half something that did not have a name because it was only his, specifically his, and she had not had a word for it before and was in no hurry to find one. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She threw a pillow at him. He caught it. He was smiling. There it was. The town's full thaw came slower than the personal one. As towns always do, institutions shift on longer timelines than people. And Red Hollow was in many respects a very ordinary small town with very ordinary small town capacities for both judgment and revision. But it came. Harold Deacon stopped Nathaniel outside the bank in February and said that he'd been thinking about the South Pasture acreage the Caldwells had been trying to expand for 3 years, and that the loan terms he'd been unable to offer Benjamin were terms he was prepared to offer Nathaniel now. If Nathaniel was interested. Nathaniel came home and told Clara. She looked at him. "Well, what?" he said. "Do you want the acreage or not?" she said. He looked at her for a moment. "You want to talk about it? I want you to tell me what you think," she said. "And then I'll tell you what I think, and then we'll decide." He looked at her with that expression again, the one she did not have a name for. "Yes," he said, "I want the acreage." "Then take the loan," she said. "It's significant debt," he said. "The land is worth it," she said. "You've told me what that South Pasture could carry if it was expanded. I've done the arithmetic." She looked at him. "Take the loan." "Nathaniel, He was quiet. "You've looked at the accounts," he said. "Every week," she said. "Did you think I was doing that for entertainment?" He looked at her. "No," he said slowly, "I didn't think that." "Then trust what I see," she said. "The same way I trust what you see when you read the weather from the cattle. We both know things. That's the whole point of this." He looked at her for a long moment. "Then all right, good," she said. "Talk to Deacons tomorrow. And tell him I'll be coming too." He blinked. "It's my ranch too," she said. "Isn't it?" He looked at her. Something moved through his face, that thing she couldn't name. "Very present now, very clear." "Yes," he said. "Then I'll be there," she said. "Now eat your supper before it gets cold." He sat down at the table. He ate his supper, and he was smiling the whole time. The real smile, the one that had taken so long to surface and that once found was so entirely worth finding. And Clara sat across from him and ate her supper too, and thought about Pennsylvania and boarding houses, and the particular courage it had taken to answer an advertisement in a newspaper. She thought, look where it went. She thought, look where it went. Spring came to the Caldwell Ranch the way it always did in Montana, not gently. Not with the soft incremental warming that Clara had known in Pennsylvania, but decisively, almost argumentatively, as if the land had been holding its breath all winter and finally released it all at once. One morning in late March, the creek was frozen. By the following Tuesday, it was running fast and silver and loud. And the cattle were restless with it, and Nathaniel said at breakfast that they'd be moving the herd to the north pasture by the end of the week. And Clara said she wanted to help, and he looked at her over his coffee cup and said, "You sure?" And she said, "I've been riding Agnes for 6 months. I think I can manage a pasture move," and he said, "Agnes is 16 years old and has the energy of a well-fed house cat," and Clara said, "Then we'll get along fine." And Margaret made a sound that was definitely a laugh converted at the last second into a cough. Clara helped move the herd. She was not skilled at it. She was honest about not being skilled at it, which Nathaniel said afterward was actually the most useful quality a person could bring to something they didn't know how to do yet. She stayed where he put her, did what he said, and Agnes performed with the reliable calm of an animal that has seen everything twice and is no longer surprised by any of it. By the end of the day, Clara's back hurt in places she hadn't known could hurt. And she had a bruise on her left knee from a fence post she'd misjudged. And she was more satisfied than she had been since the morning she'd gotten the biscuits right. "Well," Nathaniel said when they came in. "Same time tomorrow," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "The herd's already moved," he said. "I know," she said. "I meant in general." He smiled. The real one. It came easier now she had noticed that. The way it had loosened over the winter, the way the careful containment he'd worn for so long had begun to sit differently on him. Less like armor and more like a coat he could take off when he came inside. In general, he said yes, same time tomorrow. She went to wash up. And she caught Margaret watching from the kitchen doorway with that expression, the one Clara had first seen on the wedding day and had since learned to recognize as Margaret's version of complete happiness, which looked on her face very much like ordinary satisfaction because she was not a woman who performed her feelings for an audience, but simply had them, clearly and without apology. Life on the ranch in the spring and summer of 1875 had a fullness to it that Clara had not anticipated. Not because she had expected emptiness, she had not come to Montana for emptiness, but because the fullness was of a particular, specific kind that she had not known to want before she had it. She was useful, not in the careful peripheral way she had been useful at the boarding house mending, laundering, keeping herself unobtrusive and grateful. She was useful in a way that had weight and consequence, and that people responded to as though it mattered. Because it did. The ranch accounts, which she had taken over entirely from Margaret by February, were in better order than they'd been in years. She had found 3 billing errors with a feed supplier in Billings that had been costing the ranch money for 2 seasons. And when she showed Nathaniel, he had looked at the numbers for a long time and then looked at her and said, "Simply, how did you find that?" And she said, "I was looking." And he said, "I should have been looking." And she said, "You were busy looking at everything else." That's why there are two of us. That was the thing she had not had a word for before and gradually found one. Partnership. The actual thing, not the performed version. Not the social arrangement that passed for it, the real. Specific daily practice of two people bringing different things to the same problem and getting further together than either would have gotten alone. She brought the numbers. He brought the land. She brought the outside perspective, the ability to see the ranch's habits from a distance. To notice what had become invisible through familiarity. He brought the depth of a man who had worked this particular piece of Montana for 20 years and knew it the way you know something you have paid attention to without interruption. They argued. This was something she had not expected. And then, once it started, wondered how she had expected anything else. They were two people with strong opinions and the mutual respect to say them. And the combination produced, regularly, disagreements that were sometimes heated and always productive. She wanted the kitchen garden expanded. He said the water rights from the creek didn't support expansion on the east side. She looked into the water rights. He was right about the east side. She proposed the west side instead. He looked at the west side. Thought about it for 3 days, without telling her what he was thinking. And then said at breakfast one morning, "The west side'll work," and went back to his coffee as if he hadn't spent 72 hours turning it over. She had learned to wait out the 3 days. He had learned, slowly and with some difficulty, to tell her when he was thinking about something, instead of returning with a conclusion as though the process had not occurred. She told him once that she wanted to be part of the thinking, not just the outcome, and he had looked at her for a long moment and said, "I'm not used to that," and she said, "I know. Practice," and he had said, with a seriousness that was entirely genuine, "I will." And he did. It was in June on a Tuesday afternoon that Clara found out she was going to have a child. She knew before she told anyone. She held it for 3 days. The same way Nathaniel held his thinking, turning it over privately. Feeling the shape of it, making sure it was real before she made it public. Then she told him on a Wednesday evening, sitting at the kitchen table after supper, with Margaret already gone to bed and the house quiet around them. She said, "I need to tell you something." He looked up from the harness he was mending. Something in her voice made him put it down, she told him. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds, which felt much longer. Then Nathaniel stood up from the table, crossed to her side, crouched down to her level, and took both her hands in his. And he looked at her face with an expression she had never seen on him before, not the careful containment, not the working smile, not the concentrated attention of a man solving a problem. Something open, something that had no management in it at all. "Are you all right?" he said. "I'm perfectly well," she said. "Are you all right?" He looked at her hands in his. "Yes," he said. "Then I don't know." He looked up. "I don't have words for this." "That's all right," she said. "You don't need them right now." He held her hands. After a moment he said, very quietly, Benjamin would have... He stopped. "I know," she said. "He would have been glad," he said. "I know that too," she said. They sat there for a long moment. The weight of it between them not painful, or not only painful, but the kind of weight that is also warmth, the kind that means something is real and present and permanent. Then Nathaniel said, "I'm going to need to enlarge the fence around the kitchen garden." Clara looked at him. "That is your response," she said. "It's going to need to be child-proof," he said, with complete seriousness. "The latch on the east gate is too easy. Our child is currently the approximate size of a walnut," she said. "Walnuts become people," he said. "People reach gates." She stared at him. He was not smiling, but there was something around his eyes that was the precursor to it, the specific expression, that meant he was aware of being absurd, and had decided to commit to it anyway. She laughed. She put her forehead down on their joined hands, and she laughed until her eyes were wet. And he sat there and let her, and when she looked up he was smiling, the real one. Fully present, nothing held back, and she thought, "This is the man who wrote those letters. This is exactly him. And he is mine, and I am his, and we made something. And the East Gate latch is apparently the first order of business." "Fix the latch," she said. "Already planning it," he said. Margaret, when told the following morning, sat down at the kitchen table and said nothing for a full 30 seconds, which was the longest Clara had ever seen her silent. And then she stood up and embraced Clara with a fierceness that was entirely out of proportion to her size, and entirely in proportion to her feeling. "Good," she said into Clara's hair. "Good, that was all. It was everything. The baby came in February of 1876. In the same room where Clara had spent her first night on the Caldwell Ranch. In the same bed with the same heavy blue and white quilt. In the middle of a snowstorm that Margaret said was the worst she'd seen in a decade, and that Nathaniel paced through in the kitchen with a focused, contained panic that Margaret told him firmly was not helping anyone, and he should sit down. He did not sit down. He stood at the kitchen window for 4 hours, and watched the snow and listened to the sounds from upstairs, and held himself together with the same concentrated effort that he brought to everything that mattered. When the baby cried that first sound, that specific, world-splitting sound, he grabbed the kitchen door frame with both hands and stood there for a long moment before he could move. Margaret came to the top of the stairs. "A girl," she said. "Both of them fine. Come up." He took the stairs 2 at a time. Clara was sitting up in bed, looking more herself than he expected. Which was to say, she looked exhausted and completely determined. Which was how she looked when she had just done something difficult and was not interested in making a production of it. The baby was in her arms, small, impossibly small, making small sounds that seemed too significant for something that small to make. Nathaniel sat on the edge of the bed. Clara held the baby out to him. He took her, with the careful, absolute attention of a man who understands that he is holding something he cannot afford to be anything but fully present for. He held the baby, and he looked at her face, and he said nothing for a long time. Then he said to Clara, "She looks like she has opinions." "She's 12 minutes old," Clara said. "I know," he said. "She's already got that look, like she's decided something and is waiting for everyone else to catch up." Clara looked at her daughter. "She gets that from her father," she said. Nathaniel looked at her over the baby's head. "She gets it from her mother," he said. "Her father would have sat in that kitchen another hour before deciding anything." Clara laughed. It hurt. She didn't care. They named her Ruth, which was Clara's mother's middle name, and which Clara had been carrying as a possibility for a long time without saying it aloud. Because some things need to wait until they are sure of their moment. She told Nathaniel the reason when she proposed it. And he said without hesitation, "Ruth." Yes, the way he said yes to things that were clearly right. Simply and without negotiation, Ruth Caldwell was, from her first weeks, a child of decided character. She slept when she chose to sleep, and was awake with great intention when she chose that instead. She watched everything with dark, serious eyes that seemed, from very early, to be filing information for later use. She was not a difficult baby, she simply had, from the beginning, a strong preference for things being done correctly, which Nathaniel said was entirely Clara, and Clara said was entirely Nathaniel. And Margaret said was both of them, and God help whoever eventually had to argue with this child about anything. The seasons turned. A second child came 2 years later, a boy. James Benjamin Caldwell, named for both his grandfathers and for an uncle he would only ever know through a letter kept in a tin box, and through the stories his parents told. James was different from Ruth in almost every possible way: easy where she was intense, loud where she was observant, interested in physical things with an energy that meant the kitchen garden fence required upgrading twice in his first 3 years. Nathaniel took him out to the cattle pastures from the time he could walk, and Clara watched from a distance, sometimes the small sturdy figure beside the tall quiet one. Nathaniel's hand coming down to point at something. James's head tipping back to look, two people paying attention to the same thing together. She thought, there it is. That's the thing, that exact thing. She thought it often in those years. It arrived in ordinary moments at the kitchen table. In the accounts on Agnes on the creek path in the early morning. In conversations with Nathaniel that went longer than they needed to because neither of them was ready to stop. The thing she had not had a name for when she arrived in Red Hollow with a broken clasped bag and a tin box full of letters and nowhere particular to be. It had a name now. Several names, partnership. Family. Chosen. The tin box lived on the shelf in the bedroom. Between a geology survey of the Montana Basin and a book on the history of the Western Territories that Nathaniel had ordered from Billings 3 years ago, and that Clara had read first and left her notes in the margins of, which he had read afterward and responded to in a different ink, so that the margins had become a conversation between them that lived in the book permanently. She looked at the tin box sometimes, not often, not with longing for what it represented, but with something more like gratitude, the feeling you have for the road that brought you somewhere. Not because you want to go back, but because you understand now where it was going all along. The 44th letter stayed in the box, with the other 43. She had read it many times, she knew it by heart. She thought about it in the particular way. She thought about things that had become load-bearing, that had become part of the structure of how she understood her own life. Don't stand behind that headstone of yours and decide you're not the kind of man she came here for. You're exactly the kind of man she came here for. You just don't know it yet. Benjamin had known. She thought about that, in quiet moments, with a gratitude that was complicated and real. A man she had never met had seen his brother clearly enough to write those words. A man she had come to marry had, in some way she could not fully articulate, made room for the life she actually needed, even before he knew he was doing it. She did not romanticize this. Benjamin Caldwell had been a real person with a real life and a real death. And she mourned him the way you mourn possibilities honestly. And then with acceptance. But she allowed herself to believe that he had not entirely been wrong about the life that came after. It was on a September evening, 6 years after Clara had stepped off a train in Red Hollow with nowhere to be, that the thing happened which she would later think of as the moment everything completed. Nathaniel came in from the north pasture earlier than usual. Clara was at the kitchen table, with the accounts the ranch had expanded twice now. The south pasture acreage from Deacon's Loan turned out to be one of the best decisions they'd made. And the numbers were good. Genuinely good in the way that comes from years of careful work rather than fortune. Ruth was in the sitting room with a book, serious and absorbed. James was presumably somewhere causing some specific, inventive trouble. Margaret was resting. She was 69 now, and she had agreed, after considerable negotiation, to rest in the afternoons. Nathaniel sat down across from Clara. She looked up. His face had that quality it got when something had happened that he was deciding how to say. "What?" she said. "I ran into Henderson in town," he said. "About Patience Wells." Clara set down her pen. Patience Wells, who had been the most persistent source of hostile commentary about the Caldwell situation for 6 years, who had maintained through all of it a position of moral injury on behalf of Benjamin Caldwell's memory that served primarily as a framework for her to say unkind things about Clara in public. "What about her?" Clara said. "Her daughter," Nathaniel said. "Her daughter is considering correspondence with a man in Oregon. A widower with a ranch. Through an advertisement." He paused. "Wells came to Henderson asking whether he thought it was appropriate." Clara looked at him. Henderson told her, Nathaniel said, that in his experience, correspondence could be the beginning of a very genuine connection, and that he knew of at least one case in which it had led to an unexpectedly real marriage. He paused again. He said Wells did not respond immediately, and then she said, "Henderson told me this directly," she said. "Well, the Caldwell woman did seem to make it work. The kitchen was very quiet. "The Caldwell woman," Clara said. "Yes," Nathaniel said. Clara looked at him. Then she started laughing, and she laughed until her shoulders shook, and until Ruth appeared in the kitchen doorway with an expression of deep suspicion at adult behavior. And Nathaniel sat across the table with the real smile fully present, and his arms crossed and his eyes bright. And it was the specific, irreplaceable happiness of two people who have been through something hard together and come out the other side into ordinary life and found that ordinary life is, in fact, the whole thing. "The Caldwell woman," Clara said again, when she could speak. "That's you," Nathaniel said. "I'm aware," she said. "It just took her 6 years to say it. Some people need time," he said. "You didn't," she said. He looked at her. "I had 43 letters worth of practice." She pointed at him. "Do not make me like that sentence." "Too late," he said. She threw a dish towel at him. He caught it. He was smiling. There it was, still there. The real one, the one that had taken so long to surface that first time and that now arrived easily. Regularly, as a natural feature of his face when she was in the room, which was, when she thought about it, one of the finest things she had ever done for anyone. She had made it easier for him to smile. She had not set out to do that. It had happened because they had both chosen honesty over convenience. Over and over, at every difficult juncture, until the honesty became the easiest thing, and the ease became the ground they stood on. She thought about Pennsylvania. She thought about the advertisement in the Philadelphia Gazette. Read 3 times and fold it up and put down and pick back up. She thought about the first letter, sent with the recklessness of someone with nothing left to lose. She thought about 43 replies wrapped in cotton squares in a tin box, and a train station in August, and a man holding his hat in both hands with a look on his face, like a person carrying something he didn't want to put down. She thought about all the ways it could have gone wrong, and all the specific, stubborn reasons it had not. She thought about Ruth in the sitting room with her book and James somewhere doing something inadvisable, and Margaret resting in the afternoon light, and Nathaniel sitting across the kitchen table with that smile that had once been so rare and now was simply his. Just his face, doing the thing it did when it was at rest and not performing anything for anyone. She thought, "I did not arrive too late." She had thought this before. She would think it again, but it arrived each time with the same quality, not relief, not triumph, but the solid, unshakable knowing of a thing that is simply true. She had arrived on a Thursday in August with a broken clasped bag and 43 letters she believed one thing about and turned out to mean another. She had stood on a platform with nowhere to go and followed a stranger to a grave and then to a ranch and then into the hardest and most honest months of her life. She had not arrived too late. She had arrived exactly when she was meant to. Not because the universe arranged things with that kind of intention, she was still not certain it did, but because she had been stubborn enough and honest enough and brave enough, at each moment when it mattered, to stay when it would have been easier to go, to speak when it would have been easier to be quiet, to trust what she saw in a man who had been hiding in plain sight behind his dead brother's name and his own lifelong habit of making room for everyone else before himself. She had pulled him out of that hiding. He had given her a home. That was the whole story. Not a perfect story. She would not have wanted a perfect one. A real one, with grief in it and anger and 3 days of silent thinking and a music box on a windowsill and sweet pea seeds under a door and 44 letters in a tin box on a bedroom shelf and a daughter with opinions and a son with energy and a ranch that was growing and a kitchen garden with a properly latched gate and a woman in Red Hollow, Montana, who had finally 6 years late called her the Caldwell woman. Nathaniel reached across the table and picked up the pen she'd set down and put it back in her hand. "The Jenkins account," he said. "You were in the middle of it." She looked at the pen. She looked at him. "You're redirecting me to the accounts," she said. "The Jenkins account has been wrong for 2 months," he said. "You know it has. You were about to find it." "I was having a moment," she said. "You can have the moment and find the Jenkins error," he said. You're good at both at the same time. She held his eyes for one long second. Nathaniel James Caldwell, she said. Clara Ann Caldwell, he said. She looked at the accounts. She found the Jenkins error in 4 minutes. She had known roughly where it was for a week. She circled it in ink and turned the ledger so he could see it. And he looked at it and said, "There it is," with the same quiet satisfaction he brought to finding a fence post set right. And she thought, yes, there it is, there all of it is. Right here, in this kitchen. In this, she had crossed 2,000 miles to find not the one she thought she was going to, but the one that was waiting for her on the other side of every hard and honest choice she had ever made. She picked up her pen. She went back to work, and the ranch held them, the way it always had, solid at the bones, built to last. Built by people who understood that the most real things are not the ones that arrive perfectly formed and ready, but the ones you build yourself, out of grief and truth and time, and the particular stubborn grace of two people who chose every single day to stay.